What if every person who enters your life isn't random chance but a deliberate cosmic arrangement? The universe speaks through signs, unmistakable, powerful signals that someone is destined for you. These aren't just romantic fantasies, they're profound spiritual connections that Carl Jung, the revolutionary psychoanalyst, identified through his work on the collective unconscious. You've felt it before, that inexplicable magnetic pull, those impossible coincidences, the feeling of recognizing someone you've never met. These aren't accidents, they're universal signposts marking your destined connections. Most people miss these signs, continuing to wander through relationships that drain rather than fulfill them. But you're about to discover the exact Jungian indicators that reveal when someone is truly meant to be in your life. These ancient wisdom patterns, backed by Jung's psychological framework, will forever change how you recognize your most significant soul connections. Are you ready to decode the universe's hidden messages about who truly belongs in your journey, creating bridges between conscious and unconscious understanding that transform your entire psychological framework? Jung emphasized that transformative connections involve mutual evolution rather than one-sided change. Both individuals undergo parallel development processes, often addressing complementary psychological challenges. This mutual transformation creates what Jung might call psychological resonance, a feedback loop where each person's growth catalyzes and supports the other's development. This explains why relationships with destined connections feel simultaneously challenging and supportive. They push you toward growth while providing exactly the support needed for that evolution. These transformative connections frequently involve confrontation with what Jung called the shadow, disowned or unconscious aspects of personality. Someone meant for you often triggers awareness of qualities you've denied, repressed, or failed to develop. While this shadow work creates temporary discomfort, it ultimately facilitates greater psychological wholeness. The relationship provides a uniquely safe container for integrating these shadow elements, explaining why you can be unusually vulnerable with this person despite the intensity of the material emerging. Jung observed that transformative relationships often follow archetypal patterns of death and rebirth. The connection catalyzes the dissolution of outdated identity structures, creating a psychological death that precedes the emergence of more integrated consciousness. This explains why significant relationships frequently coincide with major life transitions, identity crises, or periods of intense questioning. The universe brings these connections precisely when you're psychologically prepared for fundamental transformation. 8. Karmic patterns. While Jung approached the concept of karma through psychological rather than strictly religious frameworks, he recognized patterns in relationships that suggested connections transcending a single lifetime. He observed that certain relationships exhibit what he might call psychological karma, interactions that feel like continuations of previous connections, carrying an unusual sense of familiarity, unfinished business, or predetermined purpose. When someone is meant for you, the relationship often displays these karmic qualities, suggesting a connection operating beyond conventional temporal boundaries. These karmic patterns frequently manifest as immediate and profound emotional responses that seem disproportionate to your actual history together. You might experience unusual emotional intensity, specific emotional triggers, or complex feelings that suggest a longer relationship than your conscious timeline indicates. Jung would interpret these as evidence of archetypal patterns, activating unconscious material connected to collective human experience rather than merely personal history. Jung observed that karmic connections often involve what he called psychological debts and gifts, a sense of owing something to this person or needing to provide something specific for them. These impressions emerge without logical explanation, yet carry powerful psychological conviction. This phenomenon represents what Jung might consider the activation of collective patterns of human relationship that transcend individual experience, universal templates for exchange, growth, and mutual development that exist in the collective unconscious. Karmic relationships frequently feature unusual learning acceleration, rapidly developing insights, skills, or awareness that would normally require much longer to acquire. Jung would attribute this to the activation of latent knowledge stored in the collective unconscious. The relationship somehow accesses wisdom beyond your personal experience, creating growth that transcends ordinary developmental timelines. This explains why connections with karmic qualities often produce profound wisdom, despite potentially brief duration. Jung noted that these karmic connections frequently involve mutual psychological healing, addressing wounds or developmental gaps with unusual precision and effectiveness. You somehow provide exactly what the other person needs for their healing journey, while they offer precisely what facilitates your own healing. This mutual healing occurs with remarkable efficiency, suggesting what Jung might interpret as a connection designed specifically for psychological completion and wholeness. These karmic relationships often exhibit cyclical patterns, recurring themes, challenges, or growth opportunities that appear throughout the connection. These cycles suggest what Jung would call archetypal development sequences, universal patterns of psychological evolution that unfold through relationship. The relationship seems to follow an internal script designed to facilitate specific growth for both individuals, moving through predictable stages despite unique external circumstances. Jung observed that karmic connections frequently involve shared symbols, images, or themes that emerge spontaneously for both individuals. You might discover mutual fascination with specific mythological stories, repeated encounters with particular animals or objects, or shared dreams featuring identical symbols. Jung would interpret these as evidence of connecting through the collective unconscious, accessing universal symbolic language that transcends individual experience and points toward shared psychological purpose. 9. Spiritual resonance. Jung's me concept of spirituality transcended conventional religious frameworks, focusing instead on the numinous experiences of profound meaning, mystery, and connection to something greater than the individual ego. When someone is meant for you, the relationship exhibits what Jung called spiritual resonance, a shared connection to transcendent dimensions of existence. This spiritual quality distinguishes destined connections from ordinary relationships, creating a sense of sacred purpose that extends beyond personal fulfillment or social convention. This spiritual resonance manifests as mutual recognition of meaning beyond material existence. You discover shared understanding of life's deeper dimensions without requiring extensive explanation or persuasion. Jung would interpret this as evidence of connecting through the collective unconscious, accessing universal spiritual patterns that transcend individual belief systems. This explains why significant relationships often bridge different religious backgrounds, while maintaining profound spiritual alignment on essential values and perceptions. Jung observed that spiritually resonant connections frequently catalyze what he called religious experience, encounters with the numinous that transform consciousness. Together, you access states of awareness, insight, or connection that neither experiences individually with the same intensity. The relationship becomes a vessel for transcendent experience, creating moments of profound unity, clarity, or purpose that Jung would consider evidence of the self, the organizing center of the psyche, manifesting through the relationship. This Spiritual dimension creates what Jung called meaningful coincidences with unusual frequency. You experience synchronicities connected to shared spiritual themes, encounter symbolic events that reflect your mutual development, or receive apparent guidance that supports your connection. These phenomena suggest what Jung would interpret as the relationship connecting to organizing principles beyond conventional causality, accessing patterns of meaning that transcend rational explanation. Jung noted that spiritually resonant relationships often involve mutual dreams or parallel, unconscious processes. You might experience complementary dreams on the same night, undergo similar internal shifts simultaneously, or intuitively understand each other's psychological states without verbal communication. This phenomenon represents what Jung called participation mystique, a shared psychological field where boundaries between individual unconscious processes become permeable, creating unusual resonance and mutual awareness. These spiritually connected relationships frequently involve what Jung termed active imagination, spontaneous symbolic imagery that emerges with unusual clarity and significance. You might share creative inspirations, develop mutual symbolic languages, or experience vivid imaginal scenarios that provide guidance for your connection. Jung would interpret this as evidence of the relationship accessing archetypal creative energy, tapping into universal patterns of meaning-making that transcend individual imagination. Jung observed that spiritually resonant connections often create what he called temenos, sacred space that facilitates psychological development. The relationship somehow establishes protective boundaries around your mutual growth, creating unusual safety for vulnerability, exploration, and transformation. This sacred container allows both individuals to undergo profound changes that might feel too threatening in ordinary relationships, explaining why destined connections frequently catalyze dramatic spiritual evolution despite external challenges. 10. Twin flame signals. While Jung didn't specifically use the term twin flame, his work on the conjunction of opposites and psychological wholeness provides a framework for understanding what modern spiritual traditions call twin flame connections. These relationships exhibit what Jung might call psychological complementarity at its most profound level, a connection where two individuals somehow represent perfect psychological counterparts, each embodying qualities the other needs for complete integration and wholeness. Jung observed that these profound connections often begin with immediate and overwhelming recognition, a sensation he might describe as archetypal activation of the highest order. This recognition transcends ordinary attraction, creating what Jung called numinous experience, an encounter with something perceived as divine or transcendent. The meeting carries unusual psychological impact, often described as life-altering. From the first moments of connection, this phenomenon represents the constellation of central archetypal patterns connected to the self, the organizing center of the psyche. These connections frequently involve what Jung termed conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that creates psychological wholeness. You discover this person somehow embodies qualities precisely complementary to your own, not merely different traits, but specifically the elements needed for your psychological completion. Jung would interpret this as evidence of the psyche's self-regulating function, unconsciously seeking external relationships that facilitate internal integration of opposing psychological elements. Jung noted that these profound connections often trigger what he called inflation and deflation cycles, periods of extraordinary psychological expansion followed by challenging contractions. The relationship creates unusual access to expanded consciousness, followed by necessary grounding processes that integrate these experiences. This cyclical pattern explains the intense emotional fluctuations often reported in twin flame connections. They represent necessary psychological rhythms, facilitating profound transformation rather than relationship dysfunction. These connections frequently involve what Jung termed psychic mirroring, uncanny reflections of internal states between partners. You might experience identical thoughts simultaneously, feel each other's emotions despite physical distance, or undergo parallel psychological processes without conscious communication. This phenomenon represents what Jung would consider evidence of connecting through the collective unconscious, accessing shared psychological fields that transcend ordinary boundaries between individuals. Jung observed that profound spiritual connections often involve mutual activation of what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create new consciousness by uniting conscious and unconscious elements. Together, you generate insights, awareness, and understanding that neither could access individually. This co-creation of expanded consciousness explains the sense of shared purpose frequently reported in twin flame connections. The relationship serves something beyond individual fulfillment. These connections frequently involve what Jung called teleological development, a sense of moving toward predetermined psychological completion through the relationship. Despite challenges or separations, the connection maintains an underlying pull toward reunion and integration. Jung would interpret this as evidence of the self-orchestrating external circumstances to facilitate internal wholeness, the organizing center of the psyche, creating relationship patterns that serve ultimate psychological development, regardless of conscious preferences or plans.